Daniel Harper never thought 35 houses could rise overnight on the land his father left him. But when the HOA stole his valley and built their empire of lies, Daniel turned to the one weapon no one expected, the forgotten dam hidden above their homes. What followed wasn't just revenge, it was nature reclaiming what was hers. Stay with me as I uncover this chilling story of power, greed, and a flood that erased it all. And if you love gripping HOA stories like this, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share your thoughts in the comments, because this is one you won't forget. The pasture had always been a place of peace, a stretch of rolling land where silence seemed to settle in layers. The grass bent in the wind, tall and golden at the height of summer, and deer left narrow trails that wound toward the river. In the mornings, mist rose from the valley floor like breath, hanging low until the sun pushed it away. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another piece of quiet countryside, but to the one who held the deed, it was something far more valuable than money could measure. It was inheritance, history, and the last untouched corner of a life lived close to the soil. There had been whispers for years that developers wanted the land. Surveyors had driven by in trucks, slowing down, marking spots on maps. Men in pressed shirts from the county offices had once asked if the owner had any interest in selling. The answer had always been the same: no. The land wasn't just dirt and water. It held stories. The reservoir at its northern edge had been built by his father's hands, poured in concrete with neighbors helping during long, hot days when nothing but sweat and willpower kept it going. The fields were where generations of cattle had grazed, and where wildflowers grew in spring so thick they seemed to paint the ground. That summer began like any other, with quiet days and steady routines. Then the stakes appeared. Thin wooden markers stabbed into the earth, each one capped with bright orange plastic, as if the ground had suddenly been claimed. At first, it seemed like a mistake. Maybe surveyors had wandered too far, maybe they had misread a map. But the stakes multiplied quickly, spreading across the valley floor like a rash. Soon, machinery followed. Bulldozers rumbled through the fields, flattening what had been there for decades. Cattle fences were knocked down, trees pulled up by the roots, and the once silent mornings filled with the growl of engines. The transformation was fast, almost violent in its speed. Within weeks, concrete foundations were poured in neat squares, lined up like a military formation. Wooden frames rose from the ground, skeletal shapes of houses taking form. Trucks hauled in supplies, and crews worked long into the evening, hammering and sawing under portable floodlights. Dust clouded the air where grass had once swayed. To the neighbors watching from a distance, it looked like progress, the birth of a brand new neighborhood. To the landowner, it was nothing short of a theft happening in broad daylight. The homeowners association emerged almost as quickly as the houses. Before the paint had even dried on the first set of walls, glossy flyers appeared in mailboxes across town. They advertised an exclusive gated community, with private parks, a sparkling clubhouse, and the promise of safe, modern living. Families came to tour the model homes, walking over ground that still carried the scent of torn roots and raw earth. Sales agents in polished shoes told them this was the future, a chance to be part of something rising. Few of them wondered why the land had been so cheap to build on, or why paperwork was rushed through in such secrecy. On the surface, everything looked legitimate. The HOA claimed the subdivision had been approved and registered through all the right channels. County maps were adjusted, tax records updated, and contracts signed. Yet hidden in the old archives was the truth: the land had never been sold. The original deeds still stood, tucked away in folders nobody had bothered to check. Every square foot of those new foundations sat on soil that didn't belong to the people building on it. The more the houses multiplied, the deeper the sense of violation grew. The river that curved along the valley edge had once been quiet, reflecting stars at night. Now it ran past half-finished sidewalks and half-planted lawns. Heavy trucks churned the banks to mud, spilling gravel into the water. What had been wild and free was pressed into straight lines and perfect symmetry. 35 homes rose in a season, each one a brick in a wall that closed the valley off from what it had always been. The new residents moved in with smiles and optimism, unaware of the shadow under their dream. They planted flowers in front yards, built swing sets for children, and waved proudly as moving vans pulled away. The HOA welcomed them with promises of security and community. But beneath every welcome basket and painted porch was a buried crime, one that could not stay hidden forever. The landowner watched from the ridge, standing where the trees still whispered in the wind. From there, the entire subdivision lay visible, roofs shining in the sunlight, driveways lined with cars. It looked like a perfect picture of modern living, but he knew better. He knew every brick and nail sat on a lie. And as he stood above the valley, overlooking what had been stolen, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. They had taken from him openly, and one day, the valley itself would take something back. The subdivision grew quickly, and with it grew the ambition of those who controlled it. Fresh pavements stretched like black ribbons across what had once been meadows. Curved streets were given polished names to make them sound important. Whispering Oaks, Silver Brook, Golden Hollow. Though there were no oaks, no brooks, and no hollow streetlights flickered to life at night, casting a sterile glow where fireflies once moved freely. From the outside, it looked like a shining promise of modern life, but beneath that brightness was a hunger for more. The Homeowners Association took shape with precision. It began with paperwork, then meetings, then the establishment of rules and dues. Every house was tied into the system, and every resident was bound by the signatures they gave without reading too closely. The HOA collected money from the moment the keys changed hands. Dues were high, but the brochures promised it would all be worth it. The money, they said, would bring exclusivity, luxury, and safety. With the first wave of funds, the association built its crown jewel, a massive clubhouse in the center of the neighborhood. Marble floors gleamed under chandeliers, and tall glass windows looked out over manicured lawns that stretched like a stage. The swimming pool sparkled, the tennis courts gleamed, and fountains spilled over stone walls in carefully timed arcs. Everything was designed to impress. The residents believed they were living in the most refined community in the county, and the HOA leaders made sure they never forgot it. The president of the HOA was the loudest voice, always standing at the front of meetings, promising that their neighborhood would be unlike any other. She spoke of growing property values, of stability, of a future where everyone who lived there would be envied by outsiders. Families clapped at the speeches, nodding as though they had stepped into something historic. Children rode their bikes on the freshly paved streets, couples walked hand in hand under the glow of new lamps, and the hum of sprinklers filled the night air. But while the families celebrated, the HOA leadership began plotting further growth. The 35 houses were only the beginning. Plans were drawn for another set of homes, more parks, more roads. They wanted to stretch the community across the valley like a net, covering every usable piece of land. Maps were printed with highlighted zones, sketches of new houses layered over the outlines of what had once been untouched ground. The more they built, the more dues they could collect. The more dues they collected, the more power they held. The residents rarely questioned where all the money was going. They saw new benches, trimmed hedges, and painted fences, and assumed their contributions were being put to good use. The truth was that much of the money fed directly into the pockets of the board. Contracts for landscaping were awarded to relatives. Renovations were billed at double their actual cost. The HOA called it community improvement, but it was little more than a carefully massed harvest of cash. Those who did question found themselves silenced. A family that once refused to pay dues received a lien on their home so quickly it startled the entire neighborhood. Another homeowner who complained about the inflated costs suddenly found themselves bombarded with violation notices: grass too tall, trash bins out too long, shutters the wrong shade of gray. It became clear that the HOA's polished image hid sharp teeth. The association was not only about building homes, it was about control. All the while, the families who had bought into the dream went about their lives, blind to the cracks forming beneath them. They decorated for holidays, held barbecues in backyards, and sent children to school with the confidence that they lived in the safest, most desirable community around. The HOA fueled this belief with newsletters full of smiling photos, reminding everyone how fortunate they were to live where they did. But beyond the glossy pages and polished speeches, the valley itself remained unchanged. The river still curved along its path, carrying water from the mountains to the reservoir. The ridges still rose high above, silent and watchful. The old dam still stood at the far edge, holding back a weight that no one in the HOA bothered to acknowledge. They had paved over drainage ditches, filled in marshy ground, and planted lawns on soil that had always been meant to flood. Their golden dream rested on a foundation of ignorance. Expansion was their obsession. Every month brought talk of new phases, new homes, and greater dues. The HOA president described it as a legacy, a community that would thrive for generations. She envisioned parks filled with laughter, lakeside gazebos, and boulevards lined with flowers. Yet in her speeches she never spoke of history, never mentioned what had been destroyed, and never considered the ownership written in deeds older than the neighborhood itself. The residents believed in the vision because it was easier than asking questions. They believed because they wanted to. They looked at their polished sidewalks and assumed permanence, never realizing that all of it had been built on borrowed ground. They lived in a house of cards, unaware of how quickly one pull could bring it all down. From the ridge above, the original landowner watched. He saw the lights glowing in perfect lines, heard the faint echo of music from the clubhouse, and smelled the smoke of backyard grills drifting on the wind. To the families below, it was home. To him, it was trespass dressed in luxury. Every driveway, every freshly painted wall, every glowing lamp was a reminder of what had been taken. And as the HOA planned its next wave of expansion, he knew one truth they had ignored: the valley was not theirs to tame. The past was not erased, only buried, and the ground beneath them still remembered who it belonged to. High on the northern ridge, hidden where the valley narrowed, the dam stood in silence. It was a structure most people in the county had forgotten, weathered and gray, its concrete streaked with moss and lichen. Built decades earlier, it was not grand or imposing, but it was strong. The wall held back the reservoir, a wide body of water that gleamed blue in the morning light and mirrored the stars at night. Generations ago it had been constructed to control spring floods, to irrigate farmland, and to keep the valley below safe. To most, it no longer existed, lost on maps and ignored by planners. But to the landowner, it was the heart of the valley, and its presence was never forgotten. At its base was a rusted wheel locked behind a small iron gate. When turned, the wheel groaned and shifted, opening steel gates that could unleash the water stored behind. The mechanism was old, but not broken. Every year the landowner tested it, just to be sure. He oiled the hinges, cleared away branches, and checked the flow. He knew what it could do if pushed too far, and he carried the knowledge like a secret. The Homeowners Association never bothered to ask about the land's history. They filed paperwork that looked clean, shuffled maps that left out inconvenient details, and built homes as though the valley were an empty canvas. No one mentioned the dam. No one thought about the floodplain. The engineers they hired ignored the old drainage routes carved into the earth. They buried storm channels under layers of gravel, paved wetlands into sidewalks, and filled every hollow with soil to make space for manicured lawns. To the HOA, water was nothing but a decoration for fountains and swimming pools. They saw no danger in it, only an accessory to their dream. The truth was that every house, every street, and every neatly painted fence sat in a bowl. The ridges rose on three sides, steep and enclosing, while the river curled like a boundary on the fourth. If heavy rains came, the water had nowhere to go but inward. The dam above held back not only a reservoir but years of accumulated silt and pressure waiting for release. The subdivision below, with all its glittering promises, had been planted directly in harm's way. The landowner walked the ridge often, boots crunching on gravel as he moved between the pines. From up there he could see everything: the pattern of streets, the rows of rooftops, the clubhouse with its glowing windows. It looked small against the wide valley, fragile in a way the residents could not see from their porches. He would pause at the dam, run a hand along its cool surface, and remember how it had been poured by calloused hands with little more than determination and shovels. What had once been a shield for the land had now become a weapon waiting for its moment. In the evenings, he watched the water swell against the concrete wall. Each storm that passed left the reservoir a little higher, pressing against the gates. The sound of rushing water echoed faintly through the canyon when the wind carried it right. The weight of it was immeasurable, silent and constant, a force that could sweep away everything below if given the chance. The HOA, meanwhile, carried on with its plans. They approved new landscaping projects, raised dues for community improvements, and discussed expanding to the far end of the valley. Their newsletters boasted about the beauty of the neighborhood, showing children playing in yards and families smiling in front of their homes. They bragged about safety, stability, and how their subdivision was built to last for generations. None of them considered the wall of water that loomed above them, restrained by bolts and concrete older than any of them had lived. To the landowner, the irony was sharp. The very thing his father had built to protect the valley had become the threat that could undo it all. He had not forgotten the maps that clearly marked the floodplain, nor the warnings buried in county records about water levels. He had not forgotten the drainage ditches the HOA had filled, or the way they dismissed the land's history as if it were irrelevant. He knew what they had ignored. He knew what would come if the dam's gates were opened. Each time he stood before the wheel, the temptation grew heavier. The thought of water surging through the valley, tearing through the polished streets and manicured lawns, filled him with both dread and a dark sense of justice. The HOA had taken what was his, flaunted their victory, and buried the truth beneath their marble floors and newsletters. But the dam was patient. It had always been patient. And so was he. The reservoir swelled quietly behind its wall, fed by rain and snowmelt from the mountains. The valley below thrived in ignorance, lit by street lamps and shielded by an illusion of permanence. But in the hidden ridge, the old dam waited. Its wheels sat rusted, its gates ready, and its power was undeniable. The landowner knew it better than anyone. He knew the past could never be erased, only delayed, and that someday the water would have its say. The rains arrived with the steady persistence of a drumbeat, tapping against rooftops and gathering in gutters until every corner of the valley was slick with water. For most residents, it was nothing more than a seasonal storm, the kind that sent children indoors and left parents grumbling about muddy driveways. But higher up the ridge, where the reservoir spread wide and dark beneath a thick curtain of cloud, the weight of the storm became something far more serious. The water pressed harder against the dam's wall, inch by inch rising toward the lip, its power contained only by steel gates and rusted bolts. The landowner stood at the edge of the structure, rain soaking through his jacket, boots planted firm on the slick concrete. The wheel that controlled the gates glistened under the downpour, droplets running along its spokes. For years he had oiled its hinges and kept it from locking shut, careful to maintain what others had forgotten. Now, as thunder rolled overhead, it was no longer just a piece of machinery. It was a choice waiting to be made. Below, the subdivision gleamed faintly through sheets of rain. Porch lights glowed in perfect lines along the streets, casting halos into the wet night. Cars sat in driveways, their polished hoods streaked with water. The marble clubhouse, pride of the homeowners association, stood like a jewel at the valley's center, its tall windows lit from within. Families moved about inside their homes unaware of the danger that loomed above them. They believed in the permanence of their community, never imagining it could unravel in a single night. When the wheel turned, it did so with a groan that echoed through the storm. At first the change was subtle, a thin stream spilling through the gates, snaking down the ridge in a narrow path. But within moments the trickle became a rush, and the rush grew into a roar. Water surged down the channel carved by years of forgotten floods, following routes the HOA had ignored, routes that had been paved over, buried, or dismissed. Nature remembered what paper maps had erased. The first surge reached the outer edge of the neighborhood in minutes. It slipped across manicured lawns, carrying with it branches, mud, and gravel. The force rose quickly, flooding sidewalks, spinning trash bins, and licking against the edges of porches. Residents looked out their windows in confusion, puzzled by water where there had never been any before. Some assumed it was a blocked drain or a burst pipe. Few realized that what they were seeing was only the beginning. Within half an hour, the current gained strength. Fences rattled and broke apart under its pressure, pieces of wood tumbling away like toys. Lawns became ponds, garages filled, and flower beds vanished beneath swirling brown waves. The water carried debris with it, rocks, uprooted shrubs, and even small trees, slamming them against houses with relentless force. The clubhouse, once a beacon of wealth and pride, found itself surrounded. Its parking lot disappeared under a sheet of rushing water, and the carefully tended hedges around its entrance were ripped away. Inside, the marble floors reflected not chandeliers but the muddy tide that crept through the doors. What had been built to symbolize control now stood helpless, drowning under the very force the HOA had refused to acknowledge. Cars floated, bumping into one another like boats in a harbor. Streetlights flickered as their bases filled, some snapping and toppling with sparks. Power lines hissed when they touched the flood, sending bursts of light across the churning surface. The sound of the valley changed completely, no longer quiet rain, but a deafening, endless roar of water tearing at everything in its path. The residents scrambled, but there was little they could do. Basements filled too quickly to save belongings. Furniture was left to drift as people fled upstairs. Panic spread from one home to the next, confusion growing as the water continued to rise. Neighbors shouted, dogs barked, alarms blared, and still the flood poured in, unstoppable and merciless. From the ridge, the landowner did not move. He stood with his hand resting on the wheel, watching the water carve its path back into the valley that had been stolen from him. For years he had carried the weight of silence, watching as the HOA claimed what was never theirs, watching as they paved over history and ignored warnings older than their contracts. Now the truth was visible, undeniable, and loud. By midnight, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Streets had vanished into rivers. The rows of houses, once so perfectly ordered, stood half-drowned, their symmetry broken by chaos. The air reeked of mud and fuel, a thick smell that clung to everything. The subdivision, which had risen so quickly and proudly, was now a basin of ruin. And still the rain fell. When the storm finally broke and the rain slowed to a drizzle, the valley lay in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy, smothering silence that follows destruction. Mud stretched where lawns had once been. Streets no longer held their familiar lines but had warped into shallow rivers that carried scraps of what the residents once called home. A child's toy bobbed against a drowned mailbox. A porch swing dangled sideways, twisted by the current that had swept past. The carefully manicured neighborhood, once so proud and polished, was nothing more than a soaked skeleton. When inspectors arrived, they found devastation layered with secrets. The homes were gutted, basements filled with stagnant water, walls swollen and cracking. The marble clubhouse stood in eerie stillness, its chandeliers crooked above a floor stained with silt and debris. The once celebrated pride of the HOA had become a shell of ruin. Power lines dangled low, cars rusted in unnatural positions, and the playgrounds that had been symbols of family life were buried beneath mud. Yet it wasn't only the physical damage that shocked investigators, it was what lay beneath the paperwork. County officials dug into records to assess responsibility, and what they found unraveled everything. The subdivision had never been approved. The HOA had bypassed permits, forged signatures, and used falsified maps that erased the reservoir and the floodplain. The original deed for the valley land was still active, held securely in the archives. Every foundation, every wall, every fence had been built on land that was never theirs to claim. The disaster was not an accident of weather but the result of arrogance and fraud. Insurance companies, summoned by desperate residents, refused to pay a single claim. Their agents pointed to the records, highlighting illegal development, unapproved construction, and undisclosed risk. Policies were void, contracts meaningless. Families who had sunk their savings into the dream found themselves with nothing but debt and wreckage. Some tried to argue, shouting at officials, demanding accountability, but the truth was undeniable. The neighborhood had been doomed the moment its first brick was laid. The HOA leaders, who had once strutted with confidence at their meetings, now faced ruin. Lawsuits piled against them from every direction. Residents, the county, the state. Fraud, misrepresentation, and negligence filled the charges. Bank accounts were frozen, assets seized, reputations torn apart in the press. The woman who had once boasted of building a legacy was photographed leaving a courthouse with her head low, no longer the queen of the valley but a cautionary tale of greed. The residents scattered. Some abandoned their homes entirely, unwilling to rebuild in a place that carried such loss. Others lingered for a time, clinging to what little remained, but the decay spread quickly. Mold crawled up walls, streets cracked, weeds pushed through pavement. Abandoned toys, warped furniture, and shattered fences gave the subdivision the appearance of a ghost town. What had once been marketed as the most desirable community in the county became an empty scar across the valley floor. The landowner returned to walk its edges, moving through the quiet streets where laughter and pride had once filled the air. He stepped past cars half buried in mud, past doorways marked by water lines, past yards where grass had withered. To him, it was not tragedy but restoration. The valley had taken back what had always been its own, and the truth had risen with the flood waters. The land no longer echoed with the false promises of the HOA. It hummed with the low, steady song of wind and soil reclaiming space. In time, nature moved in faster than people could return. Grass sprouted in cracks, wildflowers spread where hedges had been, and the river cut new channels through the empty lots. Birds nested in broken rafters, and deer crept back across the silent lawns. What had been a subdivision slowly transformed into a strange wilderness of ruin and growth, a reminder of how fragile human ambition can be when it ignores the ground it rests upon. The dam remained, unchanged and watchful. It stood as both sentinel and witness, its gates closed once again, holding back the steady rise of the reservoir. Its presence was a reminder of what had happened and what could always happen again. The landowner continued to tend it, walking the ridge with the same patience he had always carried. He did not need to speak, nor explain. The valley had spoken for him. What remained of the HOA existed only in court filings and scattered memories. The promise of security, luxury, and permanence had washed away, leaving only the truth. Communities built on lies cannot survive. The dream that had stolen the valley was gone, and in its place was something older, quieter, and far more enduring. The past had not been erased. It had waited, patient as water, until the day it was allowed to flow.